Welcome to this 50-year celebration of the History Lecture Series. Thanks to all of you for coming out in this challenging weather, inclement weather. My name is Raymond Jonas. I'm the John Bridgman Professor of History, which is to invoke a name that some of you will know. John Bridgman was a beloved member of the History Department for many years. He also was effectively the History Lecture Series presence for many years, taking the baton from Giovanni Costigan, another name some of you may know. The History Department is really pleased to be able to put this together. History Department faculty are engaged all around the community in various ways. In museums, you'll find them in places like Mohi and Seattle Art Museum, and other engagements all around schools, engagements all around the community. But this is the main public-facing event that we do as a department, and it's something that we do with great pleasure as a way of reaching out to the audience, our audience, a supportive audience of history aficionados, and as a way of perpetuating the tradition that we associate with Giovanni Costigan and John Bridgman, but also as a way of showcasing new talent in the department. And we've seen already a fine lecture in the series from Joel Walker. Anand Young was here last week, and we're certainly looking forward to the final lecture in the series next week when Margaret O'Mara will be here. My assignment tonight is to talk about the Rio Grande. But let me be clear that the Rio Grande is unlike the other rivers in this series. The Columbia, which we'll hear about next week, or the Nile, or the Ganges, which we heard about in prior weeks. Those rivers owe their status to their sheer might or to their centrality for a civilization. And there was a time, I suppose, when the Rio Grande might have figured among them, at least on the scale of might and vigor, from its headlands in Colorado to the Gulf of Mexico. The Rio Grande is the 5th longest river in North America. In Mexico, it's called the Rio Bravo, the wild river, which helps us to imagine a mighty river of the kind that jumped its banks and flooded El Paso in 1897. That is to say, it was once navigable, and steamboats carried goods and people from Brownsville on the Gulf as far as Camargo and Fort Ringgold upstream. But those days are over. Today, the water of the Rio Grande is over-allocated to various entities, which means that the claims on the river exceed the water in it. Here's a photo of the Rio Grande at Matamoros, Brownville. Matamoros on the southern side, Brownsville on the northern side at this point. On a good day, and here's a river in the northwest for comparison, just to give you a sense of scale. In some years, the Rio Grande actually runs dry, stopping before it reaches the Gulf. From Brownsville, Texas, access to the sea is no longer assured by the river, but by a 17-mile ship channel visible in this satellite image. So one thing is clear: we don't talk about the Rio Grande because of its might, as we could if we were talking about the Columbia. And we don't talk about it because of its spiritual meanings, or those meanings built around it, as we might with the Ganges or the Nile. Today, we mostly hear about the Rio Grande in two settings. The first being news stories about SpaceX, whose headquarters and launch facility are in the wetlands of the Rio Grande estuary at Boca Chica. The other context, of course, concerns the status of the Rio Grande as a border and as a crossing over point. And that's where we begin, because tonight I want to talk to you about the Rio Grande and how it came to define the boundary between the United States and Mexico. I also want to talk about the place of the Rio Grande and the Texas borderlands in the imagination, not only of Mexicans and Americans, but also of Europeans who, even from the other side of the Atlantic, saw these borderlands as a place of massive geopolitical significance, defining the boundary not only between peoples, but even in a sense between civilizations. And to understand this point of view, I want to count on several witnesses: Thomas Jefferson, James Monroe, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Quincy Adams, and John C. Calhoun, names you probably already know, but whose take on Texas and the Rio Grande may be new to you. At least that's the bet I'm making. So let's start with Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville was curious about the American frontier. In fact, he's famous for it, but he never visited the Rio Grande. The famous 9-month tour that provided the raw material for his book, Democracy in America, probably something you've read, at least in selections in college, high school, or middle school classrooms. That famous 9-month tour took him through parts of New England, Canada, the upper Midwest, before taking him down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, and from there across the South to the Atlantic seaboard. In 1831, the year of his tour, Texas was a province, the northeastern province, in the newly independent Mexico. His closest point of contact to Texas was New Orleans, the largest settlement on what was then the westernmost edge of the United States. For all of that, Tocqueville found Texas a useful place in the imagination as he pondered the future of the American Republic. And toward the end of his great appraisal of American society, Tocqueville invited his reader to accompany him in a thought experiment. He left behind the close observations that had characterized his work in order to adopt a territorial view. I shall be like the traveler who, after passing through the gates of a great city, climbs a nearby hill. And as Tocqueville's traveler ascends to higher ground, local details fade. He can no longer see the city's public places. He can barely make out the streets, but his eyes take in the city's contours more easily, and for the first time, he apprehends its shape. It's a great thought of this bird's eye view. Trading detail for grand perspective, Tocqueville remarks that the whole future of the English race in the New World is taking shape before me. Tocqueville can't help but note in passing an opportunity lost, that France had once held territory in North America the size of Europe. And setting aside this moment of regret, Tocqueville recovers his territorial perspective to remark that the New World had become the site of a great collision of two rival races, the Spanish and the English. And soon enough, Tocqueville's eyes settled on Texas. There he saw this racial clash playing out decisively and predictably. Though Texas was still part of Mexico, and thus under Mexican rule, a new reality was taking shape on the ground as Americans moved in, founding an empire, as he put it, of their own language and mores. And citing Texas as a model, Tocqueville predicted the steady advance of the English race, oblivious to the boundaries and to lines fixed by treaty. No matter, he says, no matter how much that treaty may favor the Anglo-Americans, he noted, I have no doubt that they will soon violate it. The land of the New World belongs to whoever occupies it first, and empire is the prize in that race. Well, Tocqueville didn't invent race, although we can see him using the word in his commentary here. And he may well have been the first to sketch what I suggest we call the geopolitics of race. The notion that race was the great silent force underpinning global power politics. And what set Tocqueville's thinking apart was not race per se. For example, the superficial morphological differences that for centuries underpinned slavery or sustained Orientalism. Tocqueville asserted something else, namely that even among populations of European descent, normally clustered together as white in racial discourse, racial difference endured as a profound force in human events. So how did this vision come to be, and why did it take shape in the Texas borderlands? To answer these questions, we have to go back to the earliest days of the American Republic, to the 1780s. In fact, we get to go to France. In 1785, Thomas Jefferson was in Paris, where, as minister to France, he succeeded Benjamin Franklin as steward of the most important relationship of the new American Republic. The Treaty of Paris, ending the War of Independence, was barely 2 years old. Jefferson, from his residence just off the Champs-Élysées, on what was then the western edge of Paris, was already thinking of the western edge of the United States. And he was thinking of it not as a fixed boundary, but as a borderland where fluidity created opportunity. And we know of Jefferson's reflections thanks to his nephew, Peter Carr, the son of Jefferson's sister Martha. Peter was about to embark on his college career, and Jefferson imagined for his nephew a future as a statesman, and he took the time to write a lengthy letter in which he insisted upon the importance of studying the Spanish language. 2 years later, in another letter to Peter, he repeated the advice, noting that future connections with Spain and Spanish America will render that language a valuable acquisition. And for emphasis, he included a Spanish dictionary as a gift. 3 years later, he delivered the same advice, even more vigorously, urging young Peter to apply himself to the study of Spanish with all the assiduity you can. That language and English, he said, should be well known to every inhabitant who means to look beyond the limits of his farm. Jefferson's advice to his nephew tells us that as early as 1785, just after the conclusion of the War of Independence, Jefferson was already assessing the practical limits of the American Republic. The Treaty of Paris, which had ended the war, had framed a generous and expansive vision of the new republic from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, but it also set significant barriers. To the south, Spanish Florida defined those limits, just as Spanish Louisiana defined the hard limits of U.S. expansion to the west. The limits to U.S. expansion effectively were controlled from Europe, from Madrid. It took the French Revolution to upset geopolitical assumptions about the Americas. It also created an opening. When Napoleon Bonaparte came to power in 1799, he was set on restoring France's empire in the Americas, starting with Louisiana. Spain had been coerced into becoming the ally of revolutionary France. And in the process, Spain was forced to transfer the vast Louisiana territory to French control, fixing France rather than Spain as the guardian of America's western frontier. So far, so good. He also sought to restore French rule in the Caribbean and the island of Haiti. Haiti had once been a French colony, producing fabulous wealth using slave labor in a plantation economy. Haiti had thrown off French rule in the 1790s. In 1802, Napoleon sent an army commanded by his brother-in-law Leclerc to pacify Haiti and to re-enslave its population. But when the population of Haiti resisted, the island eluded Napoleon's grasp, and the value of Louisiana stood diminished as a consequence. So in 1803, Napoleon chose to cash out of Louisiana, selling it to the Americans for the money he would need to pursue his European war. So Jefferson's timely acquisition of Louisiana, he was by then president of the United States, moved the boundaries on the Gulf Coast some 250 miles westward, where U.S. ambitions once again bumped against the border of New Spain. You can see here in the animation. There, though the border was fixed at the province of Tejas, better known to us as Texas, it proved porous to settlers. In 1805, mere months after the conclusion of the Louisiana Purchase, Spain sent soldiers to Texas to counter what one observer called the pretensions of the Anglo-Americans, who had already begun to spill over the border in significant numbers. This precarious situation in Texas was mirrored in Spanish Florida, where Americans crossed the border in an unauthorized migration that included African Americans who entered Florida seeking refuge from those who would re-enslave them. Jefferson's term as president had ended, and President James Monroe directed his Secretary of State, John Quincy Adams, to find a solution to the Florida problem. And in 1819, he found one. Working with his Spanish counterpart, a man named Luis de Onis, Adams concluded an agreement whereby Spain ceded Florida to the U.S. Spain also ceded territory in Texas as far as the Sabine River, marked here on the map. What did Spain get in return? Border security. The Louisiana Purchase had left the western boundary, especially in that southernmost portion, unclear. By giving up territory as far as the Sabine, Spain was setting up the river as an unambiguous boundary between the U.S. and Spain. So Spain's concessions in the Adams-Onis Treaty, as it was known, aimed to bring border security to New Spain, but they only moved the frontier of American ambition. Even as treaty negotiations were underway, American settlers were crossing the Sabine into Texas, reproducing the very problem the treaty was meant to solve. Spain hesitated, and for a time it appeared that Spain might fail to ratify the treaty. Monroe prepared a contingency plan. If Spain rejected the treaty, the U.S. would act as if Spain had ratified it. The U.S. would occupy Texas as far as the Sabine River, the boundary specified in the treaty. And if Spain adopted a hostile attitude, the U.S. would seize the opportunity and push as far as the Rio Grande. Rio Bravo. It would look something like this. So here's the border before the treaty, right here, and here's the border established by the treaty, and here's the move to the Rio Grande if Spain should decline to ratify the treaty. Thomas Jefferson, by this time retired from politics and acting as the éminence grise of American politics, wrote to President Monroe, noting that Spain's hesitation to sign the treaty made the U.S. look good. We had placed them in the wrong in the eyes of the world, he wrote. And even though the treaty with Spain reinforced the boundary between the United States and the province of Texas, in the same letter, Jefferson was already imagining the place that Texas would hold in the American Republic. The province of Texas will be the richest state of our union, he wrote, and he signed off with a nice little wink, God bless you and preserve you muchos años. As it turned out, Spain did ratify the treaty and conflict was avoided, but far from restraining American ambition, the treaty provoked it. Treaty namesake John Quincy Adams, U.S. Secretary of State, put the matter in a broader context, the context of transatlantic relations. Europe had awakened to U.S. ambitions. Britain and Spain, in fact, were sounding the alarm. For Adams, Europe was startled by our acquisition of Louisiana and was now threatening to act. Adams responded to such threats with confidence, not fear. He could only express surprise at what he called the jealous clamor of Spain and England, not because European perceptions of American ambition were false, but because they were true. Jefferson's vision extended as far as the Rio Grande, but Adams' vision was grander still. He noted that Spain had possessions on our southern border, and Great Britain had possessions on our northern border. And to Adams, these possessions and their rule by remote European monarchs were moral and political absurdities. Adams referenced the Louisiana Purchase, pointing out that it was an unexceptionable acquisition. Europe would learn in time that the United States and North America are identical. The boldness of Adams' remarks speaks volumes about the confidence of the American Republic in the early 19th century. But it also shows how much the American Republic had benefited from years of European neglect. For 25 years, from 1789 to 1815, Europe had been distracted by the French Revolution and the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. During those years, the US had prospered and grown, assuming a scale unmatched in Europe. The US, after the Louisiana Purchase, exceeded 1.7 million square miles, more than 8 times the area of France or Spain, the largest European states. So you could put 4 of each of those inside, and you'd have a country the equivalent of the United States in landmass. So there was a reckoning to come, and the European reckoning with the US was a long time in the making, but the definitive defeat of Napoleon in 1815 created the opening. It allowed the European monarchies once again to focus on matters abroad, including the Americas, fortified by their success against the French Revolution and determined in their hostility to republics, which they saw as inherently disorderly and aggressive, like the example of the French Republic being the case in point. In continental Europe, this new resolve took the form of a Holy Alliance. That was what it was called, in which Russia, Austria, and Prussia stood as defenders of Christian monarchy against republicanism. I particularly like this representation of the members of the Holy Alliance as knights, armored knights, preparing to defend Christendom. In their joint statement, the members of the Holy Alliance set out for themselves the role of fathers of families, patriarchs, governing 3 branches of but one family, yet ultimately members of the one and same Christian nation. This early incarnation of Christian nationalism under kingly patronage was not merely for show. With Restoration France on board, the Holy Allies supported the restoration of Christian monarchy in Spain. And in 1823, Britain joined the Allies in supporting Greek independence from the Muslim Ottomans. Well, watching such vigorous intervention from afar, President Monroe's cabinet discussed the possibility that the Holy Alliance would turn its attention to the American Republic, turn their attention to the Americas more broadly, and notably to Mexico, which had claimed its independence from Spain in 1821. The Holy Alliance, along with the Vatican, had refused to recognize the independence of Mexico. They want to keep their options open, holding the door open to concerted action to take it back. What Monroe feared was that the true aim of the Allied effort to recover New Spain, as Mexico had been known, would be to destabilize the American Republic. John C. Calhoun, Secretary of War, claimed that the Holy Allies had an ultimate eye on us. And their intent, according to Calhoun, was to sow discord in the American Republic. Monroe himself didn't fear direct intervention. He thought Calhoun was a bit of a hothead, but he speculated that the Holy Alliance would use the pretext of Mexico to reestablish European power in the Americas. He imagined Russia occupying the Pacific coast from California in the north all the way down to Chile in the south. France would occupy Mexico and Argentina. Britain would take Cuba. The Europeans wouldn't attack the US directly, but they would hem it in by seizing territories around its perimeter. Well, the intervention of the European Holy Alliance was one challenge posed by American territorial ambition. The other was Mexican independence itself, because when Mexico was ruled from Madrid, American territorial ambition aligned with the virtuous rhetoric of anti-colonialism. After independence, the key question was whether the establishment of independent sovereign states in the Americas, and in Mexico in particular, would change US attitudes towards the inevitable continental expansion that we looked at earlier. Would American attitudes change now that Mexico was free? Well, the answer came not through policy utterances, but through facts on the ground. The first years of independence were difficult for Mexico, as they would be for any young nation. Mexico inherited from Spain the challenge of insecure borders, notably in the province of Texas, which we've already seen, where Americans continued to move in. Mexico sought to address these challenges by encouraging settlement. They realized that the relatively scarce population was part of the problem. So they encouraged settlement, but on their terms, in a succession of colonization laws enacted in 1823, 1824, and 1825, aimed to shape the movement of settlers, notably seeking settler acculturation. For example, as it became clear that Yankee settlers were overwhelmingly Protestant, contracts to allow settlement typically were restricted to industrious Catholic families. And given that settlers were avid in their pursuit of plantation economies, and thus eager in their embrace of slavery as a labor regime, the reforms paid particular attention to slavery. Mexican political leadership sent General Manuel Mier y Terán to Texas to study the situation, and he filed a report that was very candid about the danger that Mexico faced. And here's what he says: "The Department of Texas is contiguous to the most avid nation in the world. The North Americans have conquered whatever territory adjoins them. And they conquer not with armies or battalions or invasions, but by impeccably democratic means. They make the most extravagant claims of freedom and voice deep concern for rights, but the result was always the same: settlement, sovereignty, annexation. To counter the disaggregating forces troubling Texas, Mexico merged the province of Texas with the neighboring province of Coahuila in 1824. The idea to take this potentially rebellious province of Texas and merge it with something more stable. The slave trade was outlawed in the same year that the provinces were merged, 1824. And henceforth, under Mexican law, an enslaved person brought onto Mexican territory was free by that very fact. And given that Texas was the only part of Mexico where slavery had any significant presence, it wasn't difficult for Texans, or Texas slaveholders more specifically, to conclude that these laws targeted them. For Texas settlers, these measures only underlined the risks associated with continued allegiance to Mexico, and so they inspired talk of secession. A formidable rebellion broke out in 1836. Battles at the Alamo and San Jacinto secured Texas secession. The Texas Declaration of Independence was explicitly modeled on the Declaration of 1776 as part of an effort to create a comparison, an analogy, and also to claim the high moral ground by adopting the language of the American Declaration, putting Mexico in the role of the tyrannical ruler and the rebellious Texans in the role of patriots. But the Constitution for this secessionist Republic of Texas, drafted in months to follow, gave the lie to high-minded talk about liberty and rights. The Texas Constitution made broad claims about citizenship, but explicitly forbade Africans, the descendants of Africans and Indians, from sharing in them. Manumission was outlawed. Free persons of color were forbidden to reside in Texas. And unlike the American Constitution, which tiptoed around such fraught matters as slavery and racial exclusion, the Constitution of the Republic of Texas enshrined them. So the establishment of the Republic of Texas in 1836 presented an opportunity for Europe. Alarm in the face of the relentless expansion of the American Republic persisted, but the creation of an independent republic, Texas, in the path of American expansion, created an opening that Europeans were interested in seizing upon. If Texas could stand on its own, it would pose as an obstacle to the prospect of a Yankee republic rolling across the continent. Similarly, Texas was eager for the legitimacy that European recognition would bring, and Britain and France, as global power brokers, were obvious diplomatic partners. There were some problems, though, and the biggest one was slavery, especially because Britain's opposition to the slave trade was real, and the Royal Navy worked to enforce it. Texas Secretary of State Robert Irion anticipated European objections to Texas recognition, grounded in opposition to slavery and the trade. So when the young Texas Republic, remember it exists for close to a decade, when the young Texas Republic sent J. Pinckney Henderson to Europe in pursuit of diplomatic recognition in 1837, Irion coached Henderson on how to address the delicate issue of slavery. He urged Henderson to acknowledge that slavery was cruel and impolitic, but also to point out the striking fact that the condition of slaves in this republic, Texas, is far more tolerable than in the United States. And if migration to Texas produced better conditions for the enslaved, Irion asked, why then should their migration be discouraged? That's the talking point. Well, In the end, first France and then Britain recognized the independent Republic of Texas. But coordinated European support of the Texas Republic faltered, and Texas eventually would falter too as an independent entity. But first, French commentators increasingly adopted an urgent tone with respect to Texas. And when they did so, they used the language of race in the way that Tocqueville did at the beginning. And not in the way that you'd think. It's not the status of the enslaved in Texas that warrants alarm. It's the white-on-white language of race first signaled by Tocqueville. Now, the history of ideas is difficult and complicated. It's impossible to show how something so intangible as an idea passes from one person to the next. What is clear is that within years of the publication of Democracy in America, white-on-white racism had permeated French commentary on Texas. Let me show you some examples. In March of 1839, Alphonse Dubois de Saligny was making his way. He has a noble-sounding name, but in fact he's not noble. But this is a way that if you could add a de something, de Saligny, in his case, it makes it sound like you're noble. That's what he's after, and that's his name. He's making his way from Washington, D.C. to Texas, where he was going to serve as the chargé d'affaires to the Texas Republic. That's his job. He settled in Austin, where he labored to cultivate a special relationship between France and Texas as sovereign entities. He talked up the establishment of a French colony. He projected 8,000 persons. And he sought a land grant of 3 million acres between the Red River and the Rio Grande to support it. Now, the proposal failed, but not before revealing the deepening interest in Texas as an independent entity, reinforced with substantial French settlement and dug in right on the path of American westward expansion. Weeks later, Saligny sent an urgent letter to the Prime Minister of France. And in the letter, he described Texas as the site of a great struggle of rival Spanish and English races. A few months later, a similarly urgent account of Texas made its way into the prestigious Journal des débats politiques et littéraires, a must-read Parisian publication for the powerful and well-connected of that era. Appearing under the ominous title of Invasion of Texas by the Anglo-American Race, the dispatch cast the Texas story as the first collision of modern times between the Spanish and English races. And in this language that would oscillate between botanical and sexual metaphors, the article predicted an irresistible movement whereby the desiccated, sapless race, sorry, let me back up to that. And there he is, the desiccated, sapless race of Hispanic Americans would be overwhelmed by the fertile flow of the Anglo-American race. This article, like Tocqueville, articulated this racial geopolitical vision. But it went farther in calling for preparations to act to halt this, what was called this fatal march of destiny. Less prominent figures in the French orbit did so too. Eugène Messin, a French naval officer who witnessed the Texas secession from Mexico, interpreted the Texas story in similar terms. Messin drew attention to the Battle of San Jacinto, the battle that effectively won Texas independence. And Messin offered a conventional take on that battle. Texan forces secured independence there by decisively defeating the Mexican army commanded by General Santa Anna. But then he warned against thinking of the battle merely in conventional terms, such as commanders and soldiers and terrain, the nuts and bolts of military history. In such terms, the battle was only of minor importance. But if we think in racial terms, Mesa argued, the Battle of San Jacinto was no ordinary combat. Properly understood, San Jacinto was the first decisive encounter between the two dominant races in the Americas. For men like Mesa, Texas was the site of the opening salvo in a burgeoning race war. Race was the key that unlocked the deeper meaning of otherwise ordinary events. San Jacinto was a victory for the Anglo-Saxons, in his terminology, and therefore one of the great events of modern times. It's worth pointing out that the majority indigenous population of Mexico was overlooked in this white-on-white vision of war between the Spanish and Anglo-Saxon races. Well, independent Texas couldn't stand alone. That became clear enough, even with the prop of European recognition. Texas eventually sought annexation by the United States, which seemed like the best available option, and this goal was realized in 1845. With annexation, the European vision of independent Texas as a barrier to the U.S. crumbled, and Europe's worst fears were realized just a year after annexation, when war between the U.S. and Mexico broke out. The cause of the war was the border. You'll recall where the border stood in 1819 after the treaty between the U.S. and Spain. Texas secession from Mexico in 1836 created a new boundary. The boundary at the Sabine remained, now is the boundary between Texas and the U.S. The boundary between Mexico and Texas would stand at the Nueces River, marked here on the map. Why there? Because prior to secession, that was the boundary between Texas and the province of Coahuila, the neighboring province. After the annexation of Texas in 1845, the U.S. ignored the boundary at the Nueces, claiming a boundary much farther west, the Rio Grande. President Polk sought to enforce the claim by ordering U.S. forces into the disputed territory, forcing a war with Mexico. And once war broke out, U.S. forces pushed well beyond the Rio Grande, continuing to drive south, at the same time that a second front was opened by U.S. troops commanded by Winfield Scott, who landed at Veracruz and then marched westward up to the capital, Mexico City. So Mexico was defeated, its capital was occupied, and was at the mercy of the United States. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the U.S. what it coveted, an international border at the Rio Grande, but also virtually all Mexican territory stretching from Texas to California. In time, these lands would become, of course, the states of Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah, in all a territorial haul rivaling but not quite matching that of Louisiana Purchase itself. Seen from Europe, the U.S. war with Mexico made the ambition of the U.S. abundantly clear. It also inspired talk of intervention in Mexico to block U.S. expansion beyond the Rio Grande. But how could Europe intervene, and when could it intervene? Well, the answer came with the secession of the southern states in 1860 and 61. In fact, in circumstances remarkably like the Texas secession, but that maybe is a topic for later. But the outbreak of the American Civil War created this opportunity, and emboldened by Confederate victories early in the war, Britain, Spain, and France withdrew diplomatic recognition of Mexico. And by December, the first European troops were arriving at Veracruz. Karl Marx, writing for the New York Daily Tribune, this was a side gig for him, was among the first to see the Allied invasion of Mexico as a revival of the Holy Alliance that had alarmed Monroe and Calhoun. In fact, the similarities were superficial. It's a nice sort of rhetorical flourish, but ultimately not very helpful. Both Britain and Spain abandoned the Mexican intervention within a year, in fact, within a few months, leaving France to pursue it alone. When it did, it drew upon the racial ideas developed in thinking about Texas. Among public intellectuals in France, Michel Chevalier led the way. Here he is in a carte de visite, and there's his most important book. France's mission in Mexico, he argued, was to block the growth of the United States and to defend the Latin races, threatened with subordinate status. Chevalier's familiarity with the Americas was as old as Tocqueville's. They had traveled in the States at about the same time. And he both voiced and influenced ideas that would be shared by the French ruling class. Just a few months after the publication of Chevalier's piece, a French senator named Charles Dupin, who was actually also a still famous mathematician in a certain realm, but echoed Chevalier's racial theme and the geopolitical threat posed by the United States, not only in the Americas, but to Latin Europe itself. In a letter to Napoleon III, he's the person who's now in power, this is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Dupin warned of a future where the Anglo-Saxon race, after completing its conquest of the Americas, would turn on Europe itself. For Dupin, it was in Europe's interest to draw the line in Mexico. Now, I'd like to carry on about the Second Mexican Empire. It's a really interesting period in the history of Mexico and in the United States and also in relations with Europe. And to carry on about the embodiment of these efforts to draw the line at the Rio Grande, to stop the United States and the Americas, and even to claw back territory was part of the ambition of the Mexican Second Empire. Claw back territory taken in the US-Mexico War. But that's a story for another time. Instead, I'd like to conclude with these reflections. First, that the Rio Grande was not just a waterway or even a border, but a place in the imagination that fostered a new geopolitics of race that we've been talking about. But why? What's the power of this idea? What makes it so attractive? And the answer, I think, is that race offered reach. Constructing the Americas south of the Rio Grande, specifically Latin America, was nonsense. No one term could capture the complexity of the land south of the Rio Grande, where indigenous peoples, as well as people of Portuguese, Spanish, and African descent, had mingled for centuries. Yet the concept of Latin America set the terms for a great racial conflict into which France could insert itself. It's a really interesting example of how ideas can create a context for military engagement. It was up to French intellectuals to craft the framework that would support French intervention in Mexico. As they watched the relentless westward movement of the American Republic, French intellectuals and French diplomats constructed that movement in terms of a great racial reckoning, casting France as the champion of a beleaguered race. So that's the first point. The second point is that the geopolitics of race had a long afterlife. France may have developed the concept in its attempt to limit the US, but others picked it up and put it to work in places far from the Rio Grande, notably in Central and Eastern Europe, where it would underpin an expansive view of national interest. In the 1890s, German intellectual Max Weber would use race to explain the success of Slavic peoples, specifically Slavic Poles, relative to German settlers in Prussian Poland. For Weber, the crucial difference lay in a lower expectation of living standards, which the Slav race either possesses as a gift from nature or has acquired through breeding in the course of its past history. Now, Weber's Prussian Poland obviously was miles from the Rio Grande. and miles from Tocqueville's Texas. But his comments show that the racial frame traveled well. Race meant seeing Eastern Europe not as a complicated terrain of peoples and states and languages and ethnicities, but as a racial borderland contested by two large racial formations, the Germans and the Slavs. Note too how Weber's use of the concept established both the inferiority of Slavic peoples relative to Germans, but also their dangerous capacity for expansion and infiltration for that very reason. Right? They're willing to accept conditions that we Germans won't. This expansive view of state interest, the geopolitics of race, would carry explosive force into the new century, the 20th century. Russia would embrace its status, in a mirror reflection of the German point of view, embrace its status as patron of the Slavic race, embracing what was called pan-Slavism. Tsarist Russia used that claim to intervene in Eastern Europe, famously in Sarajevo in 1914, where its determination to protect its status as defender of Slavic peoples shaped the circumstances surrounding the First World War. Meanwhile, German war aims in 1914 on the Eastern Front would explicitly envision pushing Slavic peoples back, creating a living space for the German people. This is in 1914. And this, of course, is only the beginning. At the dawn of the 20th century, the most expansive claims made on behalf of the German race and its need for living space had not yet found their most vigorous voice. It all seems far from the Rio Grande, though, where the geopolitics of race first took hold of the imagination. Thank you.
María Rodríguez Silva, oops. Oh, thank you. Buenas noches otra vez. And I have been a colleague of Ray Jonas for quite some time now. It's been an honor to sit here and hear the work that he has been producing most recently. And I will be here sort of managing the Q&A. As I work through your questions and sort of looking at them in our computer, I'm going to start with some questions myself, just to get us started and get you warm up. So I was wondering, Ray, if you could help us push the story, not push the story, complicate the story, in the ways that we hear how Europe is interested on Mexico as a boundary against the ambitions of the United States, how the United States is interested on expanding politically and territorially, but we don't want land because of the sake of land. What Mexico has, what is it that is producing, that we want to get our hands on? What is that wealth that it can produce?
Okay, thank you for that question, a perfect question, which gets at, actually gets at the origin of the story, which is why there's this keen interest in moving into Texas, across Louisiana, away from the Louisiana Purchase. And the answer is that the conditions in Texas, in East Texas in particular, are very much like those on the other side of the Mississippi, specifically in Alabama and Louisiana and Mississippi itself. That is to say that these are conditions that are ideal for a plantation economy. And so it's like the river is a boundary, but in terms of the possibilities of cultivation and wealth making, because by this time it's clear, by the 1830s, is that some significant fortunes are being made in a plantation economy in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama in particular, and that those conditions can easily move across, and they do, So that migration into Texas is very much driven by a perception of what had worked on the eastern side of the Mississippi and how it might also work in Texas. So that's a powerful force. And of course, I should say too that there's also and always, and even in the European intervention that happens during the American Civil War, there remains the image of Mexico as a source of great natural resources, specifically silver. It turns out that, of course, the silver mines have been considerably exhausted by this time, but there's that vision too. What's interesting is that after the US-Mexico War, the US ultimately holds back. I mean, they're in Mexico City, they've conquered the country, they're in total control. Why do they back off? Why do they accept, generous as they are, the limits of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? And what's interesting about that is that ultimately there's a perception that we don't know what to do with Mexico. In some ways, it's the mirror image of the concern that the Mexicans had about migration into Texas. Specifically, they're worried about a large population that is Catholic, and remember, Catholicism is seen as problematic from the Yankee point of view, which tends to favor not just Anglo-Saxons, but Protestant Anglo-Saxons as the civilizational ideal. So in the end, although there are grand statements made about how much of Mexico could now be annexed under the treaty, they ultimately step back, accept the Rio Grande, and of course its extension out to California and the border between high and low, Alta and Baja California, as the appropriate boundary between the two.
One of the questions we receive is, shouldn't we use the word greed instead of ambition when talking about the US? I guess this is very pertinent today, isn't it?
Oh, great. Well, sure. And, you know, it's true that they're interesting choices of word, and and of course when I'm putting together remarks for something like this, there are always a question of what's the right word, and I think what's interesting about, say, ambition or greed, or what I find interesting about going back to Jefferson and Monroe, is first of all this talk about expansion, at least initially, in terms of that can directly be traced back to 1776 and the values of the American Republic at its founding. That is, they still see themselves as champions of an anti-colonialism, and they see themselves as embarking on a civilizational quest that they embrace wholeheartedly. They see themselves as creating a place where people can be free. And I don't, how much we want to take these statements at their face value, and how much we want to see them as a way of masking a cruder, more base kind of ambition or greed, is maybe a personal choice. What I found interesting in the passages that I shared with you tonight was even the way that these correspondents, and Jefferson in particular, were toying with these ideas. Jefferson doesn't come out and say anything quite so crude, but he signs off his letter saying, and I wish you muchos años. It's a way of kind of winking at what's to come. And I think ultimately, whether we use the word greed or ambition, or how we want to choose what mix of motivations we want to employ, those are probably also ways that we think about ourselves and our own motivations, right? We reach inside ourselves and think about, what it is that motivates us. So these are very human questions, in some ways political questions that invite self-reflection. But I like to provoke an audience with quotations that bring all of these possibilities out and leave the messy work of sorting it out to you.
Another question from our audience is one that I actually had in mind too. Can you speak a little about indigenous groups in the region, particularly the Comanches in conflict with Spain and Mexico.
Right. So this is an issue from the very beginning. It's an issue that comes up in the kind of reports that I quoted, because there is this perception that indigenous peoples are a source of instability, and it's a source of instability that can be dealt with by bringing in settlers. So the willingness of Mexico to bring in settlers is seen in part as an answer to the instability of indigenous peoples, if you can imagine that. And so there's that issue. There's also, I would say, what's interesting about the Second Mexican Empire is that once the French and their allies get involved in Mexico, Emperor Maximilian, who would be the head of state, makes a point of reaching out to indigenous peoples in Mexico. That is to say, he overturns this racial ideology that we've been talking about and explicitly seeks to at least to recognize the indigenous population. He holds grand imperial receptions. Of course, we can see this is window dressing too. But he also, I think, sees it as a way of imagining what it is to be part of Mexico in more complicated terms. It's difficult to talk about him without giving a bit more of a context, because he's a very high-minded man, likes to think of himself always as operating according to the highest moral standards. And so for him to reach out to indigenous peoples could be something he could do in perfect good faith, even if we, looking at it, might see this as an example of rather crafty political manipulation.
Another question from an audience. How does Europe's racial view of Mexico and the US impacted their roles in World War I and beyond?
I'm not so sure that the Europeans continue to think about Mexico after the First World War in these terms at all. We know that the Germans are interested in exploiting what they perceive to be Mexican resentment of the United States in the famous Zimmermann telegram, where they hope that they can recruit an ally in North America in the form of Mexico by playing on those resentments and promising Mexico a territorial compensation if they join the fight against the United States. So there is that, but I don't recall seeing in that an explicit play on racial ideas. I would say that, in fact, towards the end of my presentation, I was really wanting to emphasize how the racial frame invented in European discussions of Texas, and especially French discussions of Texas, gets brought back to Europe and put to use in trying to define Europe in expansive terms that allows the Germans, for example, to justify an interest in Eastern Europe that might not otherwise be available to them, or allows Russia to make those claims. There's another instance where I think the concept can be useful, and maybe more specifically in the French context, and that is in anti-Semitism, because that's another example of an apparently fully acculturated and white peoples gets set apart thanks to racial thinking. It's, I don't think, an accident, but this would be another topic to pursue, that specifically racial anti-Semitism takes shape in Europe at mid-century. That is in the same period that we're talking about here. Yeah, so the question is, why did the Americans stop at the Rio Grande, and why didn't they push farther south? Why didn't they take more of Mexico? And there were people in Washington, D.C. who were arguing precisely for that. And it's a rogue U.S. diplomat who's negotiating what would become the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, who would ultimately come up with I mean, as ambitious as that treaty is in terms of the territorial aggrandizement of the United States, comes up with a more modest endpoint for that. I mean, it's remarkable. Mexico is in no position to make any claims at all. And ultimately, it's an American diplomat who tries to moderate a much more aggressive position that's coming out of the cabinet of President Polk. Right. It's a really good question. So what happens to this idea of a hierarchy of whiteness? And the fact is that it persists, and it's not unique to the French or unique to the Europeans. It is, in fact, embedded in American society and American culture. There's a really good book by the title, When the Irish Became White, that explores this issue. And the title itself, I think, makes the thesis pretty clear. And that is that, belonging in American society is always a complicated negotiation. And that that's not purely a matter of the kind of morphological differences that have often been part of discussions of race in this country, but also include discussion of race within what would appear to be the white community. And those have to do, with historical prejudices, and they have to do with racial prejudice and bigotry that are, also part of this story. And those I don't think are specific to the Rio Grande. On the contrary, you can find them in Chicago, you can find them in Baltimore, you can find them in Boston, you can find them in Providence, you can find them in St. Louis. The traces that there are still there. Historians, get to pull the threads a bit, but it's not unique to the context of the Rio Grande. That's a really good question, and it gets at the issue of the questions. I think most of you heard the status of the Oregon Territory, and what it gets at specifically is the relationship between Britain and the United States, which is markedly different. Britain is not a member of the Holy Alliance, going all the way back to 1815. Their foreign minister famously called it mysticism and nonsense, sublime nonsense, but nonsense nonetheless. Didn't want anything to do with that. The British monarchy was liberal enough that it really stood apart from the continental monarchies and the ideology of the Holy Alliance. And that carried forward too. There's a profound reluctance on the part of the British to get entangled with the United States after the War of 1812, and that carries forward to the discussions of the Oregon Territory. It's not as though this purported Anglo-Saxon racial idea endures, but in fact there's a kind of a modus vivendi that informs relations between Britain and the United States.
Well, before we end the night, please let's thank Professor Ray Jonas. Thank you so much. We hope to see you next week in our final lecture.